Okay, now we are, we'll have to clean up our act because people can see us now. So welcome, everyone. Today, I'm going to have to start with a little bit discussion of the structure because the structure becomes very significant today. So the first thing I'm going to do is pull up the structure. Where is the structure? There it is, share. Okay, so everyone can see this, yes or no?
Yes.
Yes.
Good, thank you. We're in the Jerusalem section. We've gone through the Be Called section where Jesus had 3 successful calls to discipleship. We've been through the Be With section where Jesus had 3 different implications of being with Jesus. And today we start the Be Sent section, which is the this section here. The Be Sent section. Now, this is structured differently from the previous 2 because there's only one sending, which is in the intercalation. Remember, the intercalation is you start a story, then you tell a complete second story, and then you go back to the first story.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this is very significant because although this is supposed to be and is the Be Sent section, the only sending occurs in the introduction. And the rest of this section is called by some people the bread section because the word bread comes up more times in these 2 chapters than it does in the rest of the gospel put together. It's also a very, very carefully structured section. And to appreciate that, I'm going to spend a little time talking about the structure. In the first component of the wrong place, okay. In chapter 6, verses 33 through 56, the structure is that it begins with a miraculous feeding story, and it ends with 2 stories. The first one is the 2 at the end. The first of the 2 at the end has a point-blank statement that the disciples do not understand. Okay? And then the last story of this 6:33 through 56 is a healing story. And then we go down to the A prime section, which is chapter 8, verses 1 through 26. That starts with a miraculous feeding story, and it ends with 2 stories, the first of which is a story in which Jesus says, "You do not understand," to his disciples. And then there's a healing. So you can see how very carefully structured this is. And the interpretive key, which we're going to have to spend a little time on because it's very important, is chapter 7. Okay? Any questions about that before I go on? Okay. Now, since this is so carefully structured, and whatever is introduced in this section has to get resolved in the Jerusalem section, section A prime, notice the structure. Again, it starts with an intercalation.
Oh, what happened here?
Carol, you're not muted.
I got something weird on my screen. Let me mute myself.
Okay.
Sorry.
It starts with an intercalation again, so it's exactly parallel to what happened up here. And then it has 3 components, the first of which begins with the Last Supper, which is a miraculous meal. but it's resolved on the other, I'm sorry, I'm in the wrong place here. It starts with a miraculous meal, the Eucharistic meal, excuse me, and it ends with the death of Jesus, which seems to be a strange parallel. But it's all part of Mark's Eucharistic theology, which he's developing up in the A prime section of Galilee, and then he finishes developing in the A prime section of Jerusalem. So he's developing his Eucharistic theology, and it might seem strange that we would have the Last Supper balanced with the death of Jesus, but if you're thinking Eucharistic theology, it makes great sense. Because, for example, right in the middle of the Eucharistic prayer at Mass, what is the interpretive key of the whole thing right in the middle? When we eat this bread and drink this cup, we proclaim your death, Lord Jesus, until you come in glory. So the death of Jesus is the interpretive key of the Eucharistic prayer. It's also the interpretive key of Mark's Eucharistic theology. So I guess Mark was about 2,000 years ahead of his time. Or maybe, and it's not maybe, when they constructed these prayers, they were reading the scriptures, okay? So any questions about what we're going to do today? We're going to start, we won't finish, but we're going to start the Be Sent section. Any questions about what I've said before we get into it? Okay. So I will need to stop share. So I'm back. And then I will need to get to the text, which is here. And I can start share. So here we are. And we're going to begin here in the middle of a verse. Whichever monk did this, I think it was the 14th century, he really broke it in a bad place, because this really begins the Be Sent section. And he went around the villages in a circle teaching. So remember that, teaching. That's the beginning of this first story. And he summoned, and I wanted to point out something to you. You see this word here, proskaletai. I'm sorry, proskaletai. This is summon. If you look at the beginning of the call of the disciples, Jesus called them, and the dictionary form of that word is kaleo. When we began the Be With section, the first thing Jesus does is summon, which is proskaleo. And the first thing Jesus does in this Be Sent section is he summons again. So Mark is using Greek words to tickle the ears of his audience and let them know that a new development is starting. Okay? And he summoned the 12, and he began to send them 2 by 2, and he was giving to them authority over unclean spirits. And he announced to them that they take nothing for the road or for the journey, or it could be onto the path, but that's a bit of a stretch, except a walking stick alone. So only a walking stick. No bread, so no food. No bag, so no purse. And no bronze, which would be small change coins, for the belts, so that to go out without food or money. But wearing sandals, so they're allowed to wear shoes here, but they might not wrap themselves into 2 cloaks. Now, I don't have to tell the Franciscans here But I have to tell everybody else that the two cloaks, one of them you carry with you, the other one you wear, and then at night, your second cloak is your cover. So the assumption is that they are going to be hungry, poor, and cold. And he was saying to them, wherever you enter a house, remain there until you leave from there. Now, this is an important instruction. If you come into a town and you start preaching in the public square, the marketplace, and somebody invites you into their house, and it happens to be the poorest house in town, and then other people start listening to you, don't shop around for better accommodations. You stay where you are first welcome. Don't insult your host, okay? And whichever place does not receive you nor listen to you, going forth from there, shake off the dirt under your feet as testimony against them. This is from the scriptures, the Old Testament. This is the way the prophets showed that they did not receive a good reception. And basically, it's testimony for them. I'm shaking you off the bottom of my feet, people. And going forth, they proclaimed that they repent. Jesus has been proclaiming repentance, so they're chips off the old block. And they cast out many demons. Notice they were called unclean spirits, and now they're demons. It's the same thing to Mark. And they anointed with oil many sick ones and healed them. So it sounds pretty good, right? But there's something really odd going on here, and it's this word, arostus. The dictionary form is arostos. It only occurs twice in the New Testament, and the last time it occurred was last week in this class. So I'm going to go up there and reread that line again, if I can find it. 6:5. And he wasn't able there to do any powerful deed except placing his hands on a few sick ones, he cured them, he healed them. So here's Jesus, the Son of God, who is only able to heal a few sick people. And we've got the 12 out on mission, having been sent, and they're healing sick people. Now that seems odd because Jesus has demonstrated to us when they were afraid at sea that they don't have faith yet, but yet they're very successful, whereas Jesus wasn't in his hometown. So just remember, that's an odd juxtaposition of an unsuccessful Jesus and a very successful set of the 12. And then we break the story, and the solution to that peculiar thing comes in this story. And it's a completely unrelated story. So any questions before we begin 6:14? Okay, we will begin. And King Herod heard, because his name became known. And he was saying, John, the baptizing one, has risen from the dead, and because of this, powers are energizing. We get the English word energize from this, or perking up in him. So he thinks that Jesus is John the Baptist raised from the dead. But others were saying he is Elijah, and still others were saying he is a prophet like one of the prophets. So people don't know what to do with Jesus because he's doing some things that only prophets were able to do, and he's doing other things that nobody is able to do. But hearing, Herod was saying, John, whom I beheaded, this one has been raised. So Herod is convinced that Jesus is John raised from the dead. For Herod himself, sending, had seized John and bound him in prison because of Herodias, the wife of Philip, his brother, because he married her. So Philip and Herodias had gotten divorced, and then Herod had married her. That's the situation. Because John was saying to Herod, it is not permitted for you to have the wife of your brother. Now, why? Because it's against Mosaic law. This is incest. As long as your brother is alive, you cannot have his wife as your wife. In contrast, once he dies, if the wife has no other support, Herod would have to marry her. That's the Levirate law. But as long as her husband is alive and Philip is still alive and kicking, then it's against Mosaic law. So that's why he uses that legal term, it is not permitted. Because Herod was saying, okay, it is not permitted. There's the is, not is. But Herodias, this is Herod's new wife, held against him, we'd say have a grudge against him, and wanted to kill him, but she wasn't able. Why? Because Herod is protecting him, as we're going to find out. Because Herod feared John, knowing him a just and holy man. And he kept him safe. And listening to him, he was at a loss. And he listened to him sweetly. Now, this is an odd thing to say. You might listen to him avidly or happily or confused, but to listen to him sweetly is very strange. And this would stick in the ears of an oral culture. Now, I'm not going to give away why this is so important, but it's going to come up again in a prime section of the Jerusalem section. So just remember, Herod listened to John sweetly and then beheaded him. Does anybody want to take a guess at what happens in the Jerusalem section when a group listens to Jesus sweetly? They call for his crucifixion. So this is a parallel between John the Baptist and Jesus. In fact, there are so many parallels in this middle story that I did one of my theses in master's study. I did this on this passage because basically this passage tells you the whole development of the passion narrative of Jesus. Any questions? Okay, now we have some cumbersome Mark and grammar. And when an opportune day came, when Herod made a dinner for his birthday, for his great ones and his military commanders and the first men of Galilee. So this is an opportune time for Herodias. And entering and when the daughter of Herodias, his daughter now, so it's cumbersome, but when his daughter of Herodias entered, and when she danced, she pleased Herod and those reclining with him. And the king said to the little girl. So she's prepubescent. This is a very ugly story because the pleasing that goes on here is inappropriate for somebody that age. Okay? And the king said to the little girl, "Ask me whatever you wish, and I will give it to you." And he swore to her at length. So he's taking an oath. "Whatever you may ask me, I will give to you up to half of my kingdom." Now, this is a ridiculous oath because he's a Roman appointee. He can't give away half of his kingdom, but it shows you how much of a braggart he is, and also how impressed he was with the little girl's dancing. Mm. And coming forth, she said to her mother, "What shall I ask?" But she said, "The head of John the Baptizing One." And so far in this gospel, John has been called John the Baptizing One, present participle. And entering immediately with haste to the king, she asked, saying, "I want that immediately you give to me on a platter the head of John the Baptist." And here he's called John the Baptist, which is a past participle. So notice, this is the end of John. He stopped being the baptizing one, and from now on, he's John the Baptist, the one who used to baptize, because this is the story of his death. And the king became very sad because of his oaths and the ones reclining there. He did not want to deny her. So he's coerced, basically, because of the fool he made of himself. And immediately sending, the king ordered the executioner to bring his head. And going forth, he decapitated him in prison. And he brought his head on a platter, and he gave it to her, and he gave it to the little girl, and the little girl gave it to her mother. And hearing, his disciples came and took his corpse, and placed it in a tomb. Now, this statement is going to be repeated verbatim, except for one word. After Jesus's death, someone's going to come and take not his corpse, but his body, because Jesus wasn't decapitated, and he placed it in a tomb. Mm-hmm. So we've set up the whole thing. Now, this is the middle of the intercalation, so we're supposed to draw some information from this about how to interpret the success of the disciples, of the 12. And the apostles, notice they're apostles now because they were sent. The Greek word to send is apostello, and the noun for the one being sent is apostolos. So now that they are sent, they are apostles. So the apostles gathered to Jesus, and they announced to him all the things which they did, and how many things they did and how many things they taught. So notice we're at the end of the story now, and it ends with the disciples teaching, whereas in the beginning it was Jesus teaching. So it looks like a transfer of authority has happened here. So how does the middle of this story, of this intercalation, help us understand why the 12 is so successful and Jesus wasn't at healing? Anybody see what Mark is trying to tell his audience? Compare the inside story to the outside story. You've got John the Baptist and his students, his disciples. When do they show up and do something? Anybody
After he's dead.
after he's dead. When are the 12 going to become very successful apostles?
When Jesus sends them out and they're gone from Nazareth. They're gone to someplace
After
new.
Jesus is dead.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Oh.
Yeah. But it looks like they're successful here to a degree.
Yeah. Oh, they are. They are. But it's kind of striking that they be successful since Jesus was just questioning whether they understood anything. And Mark says, well, yeah, they were successful, but they were really successful after Jesus's death. Okay.
But Paul, they started out, Jesus was teaching and he expected the disciples to go out and teach. And then we had this transition into Herod and John.
Which, like I said, is the outline for Jesus's whole passion narrative, chapters 14 through 16.
Okay.
So, yeah, the disciples are, the 12 are successful. They come back as apostles because they were finally sent. And this is the only time they're called apostles during the entire gospel, except when Jesus said, he also named them apostles, but they're truly apostles only when they're on the road. Otherwise, they're the 12. And they look pretty good here, don't they? They're not quite as good as Jesus because they don't proclaim the gospel like Jesus does, but it's kind of soon. The gospel isn't over. They haven't seen the whole thing. The other thing is that they require anointing with oil, whereas Jesus just heals people. But, they're getting there. They're on the way.
Is there any reason why Herodias's daughter is, this is the first I think I've heard of Herodias's daughter being so young.
Well,
I don't remember anybody
she's a
ever saying that.
Kosarion. In Greek, like in Old English and still in German, before a child hits puberty, all the words are neuter. And you can still hear that a bit in English, like if you look at a baby, well, you can't tell if it's a boy or a girl. You say, oh, it's a cute baby, it. So in Greek, until you hit puberty, the words to describe children are all neuter. And they were in Old English also, and in German. They're all neuter because until you hit puberty, and if she were just a girl, meaning before she was married, she wouldn't use the neuter, she'd use the feminine. So that's why I say it's kind of a slimy story, because Herod and his guests are all excited by a prepubescent girl dancing, and the whole story is distasteful, but it shows you the difference between Jesus and the way he operates and the way the political authorities operate. We already know that the authorities are religious authorities out to get Jesus. So it's you want to take a shower after that story.
It's just funny that none of the people that have portrayed this in video have ever portrayed her as a young child. So I guess the conclusion is they don't read Greek.
Well, yeah, and it's also a distasteful presentation. And people aren't comfortable presenting anything from the New Testament distastefully. But the group of people who are in this class who also did my freelance course on the Gospel of John during the COVID lockdown, I didn't have anything better to do, so I offered a course to some people I knew. John's Gospel is, in translation, it's a lot cleaner than it is in the Greek. I mean, there's some really brandy stuff going on in the background, but it's all for a good theological reason. And it's like the scriptures. I mean, the first time when I was learning Hebrew and I had to read through the whole Old Testament, Hebrew Bible, I was shocked at how racy some of the stories were. And they're all toned down into English. So we're just a little bit more prudish nowadays, I guess.
Ah,
And he says to them, come you all yourselves. That's pretty redundant. Come you all yourselves privately to a deserted place and rest a little. And this is important because what happened twice before after Jesus did a whole bunch of healings, he went off someplace privately. He needs to get away. You know, I always tell my at Villanova, I taught a lot of the Augustinians in formation. It's an Augustinian university. And I taught the younger people, I said, you know, take a cue from Jesus. You're not supposed to be a workaholic. You do good, hard work, and then you go away for a while for a rest. For they were coming and going, many of them, and they did not even have time to eat. And before the opportune time to eat, the opportune time for them is to eat after ministry. The opportune time for Herodias is when she's going to kill John the Baptist or get him killed. So there's a lot of contrast between the Jesus system of operation and the governmental system of operation. And they went forth in the boat, to a deserted place by themselves. And they saw them going. So this would be the people around where Jesus met up with his disciples. And many recognized, and on foot from all of this towns, they ran together there and they preceded them. So they got there before they even landed. Now, remember, I told you this lake is small, even though Mark calls it the Sea of Galilee. You can see across it. It's only 4 to 6 miles wide. So they could easily just scoot around the side while the boat's in process. And coming forth, he saw a great crowd, and he was moved with compassion for them because they are like sheep not having a shepherd. And you can see from the Greek that this is a scripture quote. It's a quote of the Old Testament, like sheep not having a shepherd. Now, sheep and shepherd only come up here and on the exact opposite side of the gospel in the Jerusalem section. So there's another parallel that we have to hold out for. And it's going to be a big one. So just keep that filed away in your card catalog in your head. Okay? And he was teaching them at length. Excuse me, we keep going from a dry day to a rainy day to a dry day. My lungs can't keep up. And already the hour was great. Remember, they're on a sundial, so sun goes down right after 12 o'clock. The hour was great. Coming to him, his disciples were saying, this place is deserted, and already the hour is great. Dismiss them in order that going forth into the fields and the villages in a circle, they may buy for themselves what they may eat, or what they may eat. But responding, he said to them, you all yourselves, you give to them something to eat. And they say to him, going forth, are we to buy bread worth 200 denarii and give to them something to eat? Question. But he said to them, how many breads do you have? Now they're translating this as loaves. The Greek didn't have a word for loaf, and that means you lose all the repetitions of bread, which are so important. So I'm translating the Greek word bread as bread. So how many breads do you have? Go and see. And finding out, they say to him, 5 and 2 fish. And he ordered them to recline, all of them, dining party by dining party. This is symposium in Greek, which is one of Plato's dialogues. So it happens at a dinner party. Upon the green grass. Now, as soon as the green grass comes up, alarm bells are going on because grass is green, right? So to say green grass, it's a special type of grass. This type, we get chlorophyll from it in English. It's yellowish green. And it's the type of grass that shows up in the Exodus story around the place where God feeds the people with manna. So Mark is making sure that we catch the allusion to the miraculous feeding of the people during the Exodus with manna. And they reclined group by group according to hundreds and fifties. So this is a huge crowd. Now, please excuse my bad singing voice. And taking the 5 breads and the 2 fish, looking up to heaven, he blessed them and broke them and gave the breads to his disciples. Does this vocabulary sound familiar to anybody?
Yes,
Or the mass.
mass, yeah,
Yes,
consecration.
it's the Eucharistic meal. So, you can't call this a full-fledged Eucharistic meal because it's not the body and blood of Jesus, but Mark is setting this up so that we catch the allusion to the Eucharistic meal right here. Why? Because he's going to finish his Eucharistic theology with the Last Supper. Okay? He gave them to the disciples in order that they might place them before them, and the 2 fish he separated for all. And they ate, all of them, and they were satisfied. And they took up 12, they took up fragments, the fullness of 12 wicker baskets, and some of the fish. And the ones eating the breads were 5,000 males. So everything about this story screams it's a Jewish event. You've got the allusion to the Exodus. You've got 12 only males present because the women didn't leave the house except at sunrise and sunset. And the wicker baskets here, koffinon, we get coffin from it in English, so they must have been big. The wicker baskets are made out of a type of wicker that grows along the Jordan River. So it's very Jewish. Everything about this story is Jewish. That's important. Not yet, but it will be. Okay. Any questions?
So, Professor, just a comment. This pattern where Jesus demonstrates his healing, cures some people, and then withdraws to go away. Isn't that part of he's trying to tamp down people becoming too emotional? That people who start to see diseases be cured and people be restored to health and so on, they're going to get excited. You're going to have a mob on your hands pretty soon. You're going to have people putting them on the shoulders and starting to head for some town or something. Isn't Jesus trying to keep the temperature down?
He could be, because he certainly does tell people don't say anything. It seems like he's trying to keep things quiet. But the reason I emphasize, and I agree with you, yes, that's the answer to your question. I think the more important thing is when he says, come privately. Because when he goes away, that word katidion keeps coming up. He's out there preaching, and then privately with his disciples, he talks, and then he goes privately to pray. So this katidion keeps coming up. And that's what I'm catching onto, the verbal cues from the text. But yes, you are correct. I want to make sure you don't miss the verbal cues that Mark is giving his audience. He's really stressing the fact that after a lot of work, you take a break. But notice, when a group of people shows up, Jesus's break goes away, and we're going to see that again and again. You know, he wants to take a little time away, but when people show up and they're eager, he'll still teach them, or he'll still heal them. But the paradigm is take a break once in a while. You know, you've got to go off by yourself, relax. He's going to tell the disciples 3 times in this gospel to pray. They never do it. But, you know, he goes away and prays. So, and it's not the disciples' fault that they don't go away and pray when he says to, because, well, we'll find out later, but they have an excuse, okay? And I lost track of where I was, so we'll have to find it. And
I think we're at,
okay, we're at
44.
45. Any other questions or comments? Like I said, everything in this section is super important for what happens in Jerusalem. So if you have questions, ask them. And immediately he compelled the disciples, his disciples, to embark into the boat and precede him to the other side towards Bethsaida. Bethsaida, I'm reading the Greek, while he dismissed the crowd. And like I told you last time, the disciples, 4 of whom are fishermen, really are not good at being on the sea by themselves. And saying goodbye to them, he went forth to the mountain. Again, the mountain is a theological place. He's going to pray. And when evening happened, the boat was in the middle of the sea, and he was alone on the land. And seeing them working hard in the rowing, because the wind was against them, about the 4th watch of the night, which would be around 3 a.m., he comes to them walking on the sea. Now, this is important because according to the scriptures, only once is something portrayed as walking on the sea, and that is the Spirit of God in the creation account. So now not only can Jesus do what only God can do, but Jesus can also do what the Spirit of God does. If anybody ever says there isn't a true divinity of Jesus in Mark, please correct them. And he wanted to pass by them. Now, this isn't a theological word from the scriptures. This is used very prominently in the story of Elijah the prophet, when he wanted to give up his ministry because everybody was against him, and he fled to a mountain, which is where Jesus just was, and he's waiting for God, and God says, I will pass by. But of course, you can't look at God pass by, because if you do, you're going to be fried. Human beings cannot look at God. Even Moses, who was given a special dispensation, had to cover his face because it was so hideous from the experience. But nobody else was ever given permission to look at God. But he wanted to pass them by. So he's just done something only the Spirit of God can do. And now he's imitating God and passing by them in a divine, miraculous act. So he's trying to give them every clue without saying, hey, look, I'm the Son of God, I'm the Messiah. He wants them to figure it out for themselves. But seeing him walking on the sea, they thought that he's a ghost, and they cried out. So again, the disciples aren't getting it. They're supposed to be witnessing Jesus's divine nature, and instead they're afraid. For all of them saw him, and they were completely stirred up. And this is really bad. They were completely stirred up. But immediately he was speaking with them, and he says to them, be courageous. It is I, which, by the way, ego eimi is God's name in the scriptures. I am. Don't be afraid. So fear is not the proper reaction. Understanding should be the proper reaction. They should figure out, hey, this guy is like God. He's also like us because he eats and sleeps, but he's like God. And he went up to them into the boat, and the wind ceased, and very much exceedingly in themselves, they were out of their minds. I mean, they're not getting it. This isn't a good thing. This verb. This is when you're, well, in Greek, it's the way that they'd say you're crazy. And it's not good crazy. They're supposed to be witnessing everything he does and drawing the conclusion of who he is, and they're not getting it. And here's a comment directly from Mark, because they didn't understand about the breads, but their heart was hardened. So the problem is they didn't understand the feeding story. Who can miraculously feed people in a desert place? God. And now Jesus. What does that tell you about Jesus? He is like God. Of course, he's also like us because he eats and he drinks and does all that good stuff. They didn't understand about the breads, which is why they were afraid instead of recognizing his divinity. So this is a very negative statement about the disciples. Any questions? So they went from being stars at going out and doing all this wonderful preaching and healing and casting out demons to being really negatively portrayed. And this is something we're going to see over and over again. Whenever they look good, hold your breath, they're going to look bad. And passing upon the land, they came to Gennesaret. And moored. So wherever they got off, they dragged the boat to a place where they could moor it at Gennesaret. And when they exited from the boat, immediately recognizing him, they were running around all of that region, and they began, where's the rest of this verb? They began to bring around upon beds the ones being sick wherever they heard that he is. And wherever he entered into a village or into a town or into a field, in the marketplaces, they placed the ones being sick, a different word from the one we saw before. This is the actual word they use all the time. And they begged him that even the tassel of his garment they might touch. And however many touched him or it, the tassel, were saved. So again, we're using the word save for physical healing. So we finished the first A section of this part of the Galilee section. So Jesus is still doing what nobody else can do, but the disciples still aren't getting it. Any questions?
Isn't,
I have-
isn't there a message there, Professor, that it's Jesus who picks these men, and he picks them knowing that most of them are not educated or sophisticated. Some are, but most are not. The stories we're reading tonight were written years and years after the fact, so Mark has the benefit of hindsight. He's able to recount these stories and pull out the conclusions that come to him. But in a sense, Jesus must have known that in picking these men, it was going to be a struggle for them to grasp his divinity. It wasn't going to happen the first time, maybe not the second time, maybe not the third time, but it was going to be an effort. Jesus must have known that, and so he carried out those efforts.
He does, but we're in starting chapter 7. I mean, how many times? Notice they have hardened hearts. It's not that they're dumb, it's that they are resistant. There's a difference there. Because remember, your thinking apparatus is your heart. You feel with your gut. Your anger comes out of your kidneys. You think with your heart. They had a very strange anatomy back then, but it's not that they're slow. Mark says, I mean, don't listen to Paul Danove, because their hearts were hardened. They are resistant. They're stubbornly not getting it. So I will grant you this, without Mark's statement there at the end, sure, I mean, this is like nothing anybody has ever seen. But Mark goes out of his way to point out it's not ignorance or low IQ, it's hardened hearts that are the problem. So I agree with everything you said, but if we're going to take Mark at face value, he's blaming it on them. Fair or not. Anything else on that before I go to Carol?
My question is maybe silly, but I'm kind of, the word tassel of his garment, could that possibly mean that he wore the garment that Jewish men wore, like a prayer garment, not the shoulder one, but I thought there was one that had.
That is possible. The word can either mean tassel or fringe, so it's ambiguous because every garment has a fringe. but not every garment has a tassel, and the Greek is ambiguous there. So it could be, or I wouldn't draw too strong a conclusion either way. I chose tassel. I could have chosen fringe, and that would be, it's the same
Okay.
word in Greek.
Just thought maybe it was a reference to the fact that he was Jewish.
Yeah, and the other thing we would have to establish is, and I can't do this because I don't know, if this word is used specifically for garments in the scriptures that have tassels. I've read all of the Old Testament in Hebrew, and I've read most of it in Greek, but I don't remember. I'm sorry, I'm getting old, Carol.
No, no, it's probably unimportant. It just sort of struck me.
No, but it's an interesting thought. No, I like things like this keep me thinking, which is good because I'm at that age where I have to keep thinking. Anything else before we start the interpretive key of this whole section, chapter 7? And the Pharisees and some of the scribes coming from Jerusalem, and the scribes are going to be the important people here for later developments. So the Pharisees and some of the scribes coming from Jerusalem gathered to him, and seeing some of his disciples that they eat with defiled hands, that is, unwashed. Okay. The words are all jumbled in Greek, which you can do because the endings tell you. Some of them seeing his disciples that with unclean hands, that is, unwashed, they are eating the breads. And then here's an aside from the narrator, Mark. For the Pharisees and all of the Jews, if they do not wash their hands to the fist, we would say to the wrist, but that's the way they would say it, do not eat, holding the tradition of the elders. Now, what is the tradition of the elders? So I held this up to you once before, but I'm going to have to do it again. So let's hope that nothing catastrophic happens. Let's see. Where can I put this that you can see the whole thing? The law is like an onion. The Mosaic law is like an onion. At the center, there is love God. That's it. That's number one, no doubt about it. And then there are the 10 commandments. And then there are the 800 other commandments. So this is decreasing importance. If you don't love God, the whole show's over. If you love God and do the 10 commandments, you're on the right track, but then you've got to keep all 800 plus commandments. The problem is the commandments are not always easy to interpret. So what has developed is called the tradition of the elders. And this is thousands and thousands of rules and regulations that surround the law. The way the rabbis put it is, it hems in the law. So if you want to make sure not to break any of the 813 commandments, they've got thousands. In fact, if you added them all up, I bet it would be more than 10,000 rules and regulations on how you can do things. The law says that you shouldn't eat with defiled hands. The tradition of the elders says, therefore, you've got to stick your hands in water up to the wrist and scrub them around. They didn't use soap, but you get off the big stuff and then you can eat. That's the tradition of the elders. Anybody have a question? Notice the tradition of the elders is the tradition of human interpretation, not God's law. It's the tradition of the elders. It's human law. And that's going to be key to what happens here. Any questions before we go? Okay, let's go back. Now, I have to point out something to you here because something big is going on in Greek that you can't see at all in translation. You see this word holding the tradition, paradosin. Well, when I outline it, you can't see it at all, paradosin. Paradosin in Greek is that which is handed over. If you're a Greek speaker, this is very important because we found out in chapter 3, verse 13, that Judas Iscariot was going to hand Jesus over. We translate that as betray, which is horrible. It's a betrayal, of course, but we lose the connection. What do the elders hand over? Their tradition. What do the Pharisees and scribes from Jerusalem do? They hand over the tradition of the elders. They hand over the handover of the elders. So what the Pharisees, the scribes, and the elders hand over to the next generation is their tradition, but they choose to hand over Jesus to death. You see what's going on in the Greek? They're choosing their human traditions over Jesus. And you lose the whole thing in translation. But you could even hear the two words are, it's the same root in Greek. Tradition is paradosis, and handover is paradidomi. It's the same verb noun. In fact, there's a form of the Greek word paradidomi, which is paradose, and here we have paradose. So you can't miss it in Greek, okay? And from the marketplace, if they do not, and this is just funny, this is baptize, which just means dunk in Greek, unless they dip it or dunk it or baptize it. So this is the type of baptizing they do. They do not eat it. But there are many things which they take along to hold on to. And this is important because krateo, hold on to, is what the soldiers do when they arrest Jesus. And the soldiers are from the chief scribes and elders. So they want to hold on to their tradition. They hold on to Jesus only long enough to hand him over. All of this is going on in the background in Greek, but you just can't hear it in English because they're going to translate this as arrest when we get to that part of the gospel. But it's the same word in Greek. The Greek-speaking people could hear this. So, and of course, the handing over, the holding on to, all of this is going to show up in the arrest and trial of Jesus. So the Greek speakers who heard the gospel are catching all of this, and we're missing all of this. But there are many other things which they hold on to. Baptisms of dunkings of cups and pots and of copper vessels and beds. I don't know how you dunk a bed, but I guess you could bring it to the stream or something. And they asked, the Pharisees and the scribes asked him, why is it that your disciples do not walk according to the handover, the tradition of the elders, but eat bread with unclean hands? So they're very bent out of shape that his disciples aren't following the tradition of the elders, which is not God's law. That's not Mosaic law. That's human law. But he said to them, Well did Isaiah prophesy about you hypocrites, as it was written, this people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far, far away from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as teachings the commands of human beings. So what do they teach? Do they teach the law or do they teach their teachings? They teach their teachings. Leaving behind the commandment of God, they hold on, you hold on to, this is the word that's going to be used for seizing and arresting Jesus later, the handing over of human beings. So you leave behind the commandment of God. And then he gives them an example. And he was saying to them, well, do you set aside the commandment of God in order that your tradition, what you hand over, may stand? Because Moses said, honor your father and your mother, and the one speaking against or speaking evil of, this could also mean cursing, father or mother, let that one die by death. Now, this is a pure Semitic expression. This comes straight from Aramaic. The first time I read this in Hebrew, I got goosebumps. Most Tammuz, you will die by death. In other words, you're going to be deader than a doornail. But you all say, and notice he emphasizes you all here. You all say, if a human being says to father or mother, korban, which is a gift, whatever you might profit or benefit from me, no longer do you permit him or her to do anything for the father or mother, nullifying the word of God for your tradition, which you hand over. So here's what happened. There was something called korban. Any person could walk into the temple and say, I designate as a gift whatever you wanted, food, property, money, to the temple at my death. Okay. Now, they didn't have Social Security back then. It was the duty of the sons to take care of the parents when they got older. But if somebody walked into the temple and said, when I die, I'm going to give all my money to the temple, then they said, well, because the temple is more important than your parents, you don't have to support your parents. And Jesus said, wait a minute, the temple doesn't show up in the 10 Commandments. They're right at the core. Well, one step away from the love of God is the 10 Commandments. You're putting one of the 10 Commandments below a pledge to the temple. Because in the tradition of the elders, if you promise anything to the temple, it's a promise to God, and that rules out everything else. But that's not what the law of God says. The law of God says you got to honor your parents before God mentions anything about the temple in the other laws. So you see their tradition, we would call this in legal terms casuistry, has set up a number of human laws that contradict God's law. And let's read this whole one again. You nullify the word of God for your tradition, which you hand over. And you do various many such things. So you do, the tradition of the elders is riddled with stuff like this. And you're criticizing my disciples? You see the problem? Any questions? So from this, I take it that Jesus has little to no respect for the tradition of the elders. And if you think about it, what does this say about the Pharisees and scribes who scrupulously follow the tradition of the elders? Well, if you're going to follow thousands and thousands of human-made rules and Mosaic law at the same time, you're involved in innumerable internal contradictions, but you're also not worshiping God. You're worshiping law. In vain do you worship me. It's all lip service. You're more concerned about your rules and regulations than you are God. In Catholic circles, we'd say that you are scrupulous, which is a very debilitating spiritual condition. You've got to keep love of God at the center. And then you work your way out through the commandments. Any questions? Now, let me ask you one thing. If you are preoccupied 24 hours a day with following the tradition of the elders, how are you going to react to Jesus? Anybody?
Jesus isn't following all the rules, so there's going to be a very negative reaction.
Very negative reaction. He's undermining. Remember, the tradition of the elders is supposed to help you keep from breaking Mosaic law. You're undermining the bedrock of their belief system. You're challenging everything they hold sacred. This is not a good sign for Jesus. And summoning again the crowd, he was saying to them, listen to me, all of you, and understand. Now, Mark just said that that the disciples didn't understand. He says, listen to me, all of you, and understand. There is nothing entering from outside the human being into him or her, which is able to defile him or her. I'm sorry, defile him or her. But the things going out of the human being are the things defiling the human being. Now, just think about that. There's nothing on the outside entering in that defiles a human being. What happened to all of the rules and regulations about defilement? He cancels them. He explicitly rejects all those elements of the tradition of the elders that deal with defiling. And he does it in public. And when he entered into a house apart from the crowd, his disciples were asking him the parable. Now, remember, we saw this expression before. They want a point-by-point explanation of what he meant. So they're asking the right question. And he says to them, thus also you are without understanding? Poor Jesus, I think he's getting a bit exasperated at this point. Don't you know that everything outside entering into the human beings, to the human being, is not able to defile him or her? Don't you know that? I just said it. What's going on here? because it doesn't go in to the heart, but into the stomach and into the latrine, and comes out into the latrine. And here's a narratorial comment: cleansing all the foods. Well, if nothing that goes into you can defile you, then all the kosher laws are now out. But the kosher laws are part of Mosaic law. So Jesus has said, well, I don't take any of this defiling stuff from the tradition of the elders. And Mark says, when he said about nothing can defile you coming from outside into you, that also covers the kosher laws, which are part of Mosaic law. So this is a step up from just doing away with the tradition of the elders. Now we're starting to demolish parts of Mosaic law. But he was saying the thing coming out of the human being, that is what defiles the human being. For from within, from inside, from the heart of human beings, are evil arguments coming forth, are evil arguments, sexual immorality, thievery, murder, adultery, pleonexia. What does it mean? I'll have to look it up. I haven't seen this word for a long time. Avarice, wickedness, deceit, aselgeia, sensuality, evil eye, blasphemy, pride, foolishness. All these evil things, come forth from within and defile the human being. That's what defiles the human being. And you know, we've got a number of the 10 Commandments covered here. Those are the things that defile the human being, not any of this stuff on the outside. Now, think about this for just a minute. If there's nothing concerning the outside of a human being that can defile a human being, then kosher is no longer applicable to Jesus's disciples. What else on the outside can identify at least males? Circumcision. It doesn't, not being circumcised doesn't defile you. So he's basically demolished a big chunk of Mosaic law here. And if you demolish those aspects, those particular aspects of Mosaic law, what does that do? Think in town. Can you recognize a Jew at a restaurant in the first century? Yeah, the main meat of the Roman Empire is pork. Jews can't eat pork. If you go to the baths, well, you can see the Gentiles, the non-Jews, don't get circumcised, the males do. If you take away kosher and circumcision, what have you basically done? You've removed any physical characteristic that distinguishes Jews from Gentiles. Any physical characteristic that can distinguish Jews from Gentiles. So Jesus has just laid the framework for destroying the distinction between Jews and Gentiles. What's lacking is faith in God, right? This is very important. Hold on to that. That's what still distinguishes Jews and Gentiles. And this will be the last story we can get to today. But from there, standing up, he went forth to the territories of Tyre, which is Gentile territory. This is the first time he has explicitly been stated in Mark's gospel of going to Gentile territory. Why? And entering into a house he didn't want anyone to know. He figures that at least if I go to Gentile territory, I can get my rest. But he wasn't able to remain hidden. But immediately, a woman hearing about him whose her daughter, this is a Semitic thing, Mark didn't do his translating very well here, whose daughter had an unclean spirit. Coming, she fell at his feet. But the woman was Greek, a Syrophoenician by race, and she asked him that he cast the demon out of her daughter. Okay. This story begins comically. If you wanted to paint a picture of the most unclean human being from the Jewish perspective, this woman rings every bell. She's a woman. Like I told you before, women are usually frequently unclean. She's a Greek. They're all unclean by definition. She's a Syrophoenician. Not only is she unclean, but she's a traditional enemy of the Jewish, Israelite community. She's got a daughter who has a demon, and she comes to Jesus instead of a man, which is the way it should happen, which means either she's unmarried, and so the daughter is illegitimate, or at best, she has a husband who won't support her. So this woman has everything in the world going against her. And in the first century, this would be what is called comically tragic. I mean, nothing else can go wrong for this woman unless a piano fell on her head. So she is the poster child of unclean. And if you think first century people were so bad for thinking this comical, my students, I would say, who's tragically comic? There's always somebody. Now, the last time I taught this gospel, it was Mr. Bean, a British character who everything horrible happens to, and it's funny. Okay, so we haven't grown up much since then. And he says to her, permit first the children to be satisfied, because it is not good to take the food of the children and throw it to the dogs. This is a highly inflammatory, insulting statement. Jesus reacts to her. Now, technically, this is the first Gentile he's ever met, according to Mark. Technically, he's very insulting to her. And basically, he calls her a dog, which, by the way, is what Gentiles are called by the prophets in the Old Testament. Why are they called dogs? I think it's Isaiah who tells us why they're called dogs. But I could be wrong. My memory isn't what it used to be. Because they lick their own vomit. That's how unclean they are. So he reacts to this Gentile woman exactly the way any Jew of his day would react. This is pretty scandalous, and if you don't believe it, this is the first story from Mark that Luke completely throws out. It's scandalous. And Matthew tries to turn it into banter. and John doesn't have it. That's how scandalous this statement is. But she responded and said to him, Lord, even the dogs under the table eat from the scraps of the children. So she basically puts him in his place. And he said to her, because of this word, which word? Because of this word. Which word? I'm going to reread the sentence to you. You tell me the word. But she said to him, Lord, even the dogs under the table eat from the scraps of the children. Which
Lord,
word?
Lord.
What?
She called him Lord.
She called him Lord. She is the first human being in this gospel to call Jesus by his appropriate title. Which means what? She has faith.
She believes who he is, that he
Yes.
can actually, yeah.
She is the first person who fully believes properly who Jesus is. Why? Because Lord is the title for God in the Old Testament. And he says, for because of this word, go, the demon has gone out of your daughter. Because of that word, what just happened to Jesus? Metanoia. He changed his mindset. He already said that there's no distinction between Jews and Gentiles on the outside. What's missing? Well, Gentiles don't have faith. And the first person who calls him by his correct title in this gospel, the first human being to do so, is a Greek Syrophoenician woman. And as soon as he hears that, he acts just the way he would act for a Jew. Which is why, if you go all the way back to the beginning of the gospel, John had proclaimed a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sin, metanoia, change of mindset, and Jesus got baptized by him. And as I said, Jesus did not have sin. This is the first time he ever met a Gentile. He had no way of dealing with them besides the way he was brought up, the way his culture would. The moment he hears the word Lord, he relates to her exactly the way he would relate to one of the chosen people, the Jews, thereby demolishing the distinction, the complete distinction between Jew and Gentile. It's not whether you follow this rule or that, or you look like this or that. It's whether or not you have faith and act on it. Notice she has to act on it.
I think now this is where Jesus is starting to practice what he's preaching.
Right. I mean, he had the theoretical groundwork worked out in his head, and it took interaction with an actual Gentile for him to see, oh, the same thing applies to Gentiles. So he repented and did the gospel. And going forth from to her house, she found the child cast on the bed, and the demon having gone forth. Now we have less than a minute. I'm just going to say this. Starting with this woman, Jesus is now going to produce one of each of the types of healing he did, type of miracle he did. For the Jews, he's going to do one of each. He cast out a demon. He's going to heal a deaf mute man. and he's going to feed a group of Gentiles with a miraculous feeding. So the first thing he does when he realizes this is he starts over with the Gentiles. Okay? But we're going to have to wait until next week to see that. Any quick questions before I have to close? I told you it was getting good.
Thank you, Paul.
Okay,
Thank
take care.
you.
See you next week.
Thank you,
Bye.
Professor. Good night.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Prof. And good night, everyone.
Oh, it was
Okay,
excellent,
Professor.
excellent. Makes my mind work. Good night.
Good night, all. Okay, I'm going to have to close this out, even though there's one person still here. Take care. Bye-bye.